Over more than 2 years of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, it is no secret how much drones have played a part in changing the way war is waged, not only here in Ukraine, but for the whole world and for the future of warfare. Today we're going to discuss this and more with one of the world's top military aviation experts. Professor Justin Bronk is a senior research fellow for airpower and technology at the Royal United Services Institute in London, and he's been constantly writing about the developments in air warfare in Ukraine and its implications for the world. We're in an interesting kind of phase in the full-scale war against Ukraine, where we see more and more kind of new types of combat in the air and strikes from the air that we'd never seen in a war beforehand. We talk about FPVs hitting combat helicopters above the battlefield, as we've seen in the operation in Kursk. We see more and more FPV drones targeting other large fixed-wing reconnaissance drones. But of course, maybe more importantly, we've seen a constant spate of attacks on airfields, on stationary. So just from your perspective, what kind of trends are you seeing here in terms of how drones in general are shaking up the traditional air power battlefield, and what should we be looking out for?
So we've seen the use of FPV type drones, attempted use at least, against helicopters quite a bit last year in 2023 during the counteroffensive, because in that counteroffensive the armed forces of Ukraine were struggling to find good answers to Russian Kamaz 52 and Mi-28 Havoc helicopters sitting about 10 kilometers behind the front lines and launching anti-tank guided missile attacks on the Ukrainian vehicles that did manage to periodically breach through those very, very deep defenses. And because they were hovering for only usually 5 or 6 minutes at a time, and about 10 kilometers back from the front lines, they were typically outside the range of traditional short-range ground-based air defense systems. So those Russian attack helicopters were a significant problem for Ukrainian attempts to break through and exploit breakthroughs. What you then saw was attempts to use FPV drones to target those helicopters, to intercept them. The big problem that you had in that scenario, and the reason why there weren't, as far as I'm aware, any confirmed successes that during 2023, is basically range and travel time. So the typical range of a small FPV is depending on the number of battery packs and how many. If you put 2 battery packs on, you can have a reasonable payload. If you're putting 3 battery packs on a sort of standard Mavic type, then you're actually really not carrying much, and you're still probably struggling to push far beyond about 10 kilometers. And that's assuming Russian electronic warfare was allowing you to maintain the control link out that far, which often it wasn't. And then in addition, you have travel time. So to get to those extended ranges, right at the kind of edge of what FPVs could do, you can't really go at full sprint speeds. And even for fast racing drone derivatives, you're looking at probably 3 to 5 minutes to cover 8 to 10 kilometers. And so even where those FPVs were being launched right from pretty much the spearhead of a breakthrough or a newly captured position, if a Russian helicopter gunship is on station for maybe 6 minutes to conduct ATGM attacks, there's almost no way of getting it out there in time to complete an interception before the helicopter moves off, even if you could get the range. What's changed with the Kursk incursion is that because the Russians are suddenly trying to operate helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft over and around front lines that are much more fluid, where they haven't had time necessarily to set up that kind of definitive front line with deep defenses, and so can have helicopters just sat back behind them a safe distance. Those helicopters are coming much closer to FPV operators, and therefore there's more opportunities for FPV type interceptions of helicopters of like we saw with the Havoc, I think last week. So it's mainly just because of the range and the time distance problem that you typically have with standoff distances. And that's something you see with a lot of UAVs. If you have ones that are very cheap and mass produced, they generally are quite small and therefore they generally don't go very far. The exception would be Ukraine's attempts to produce at scale rather successfully a range of one-way attack, fixed-wing one-way attack UAVs, essentially propeller-powered small cruise missiles. Those are either purpose-built designs or derived from ultralight aircraft. They can travel a very long way, but they do so very slowly in order to be efficient enough to carry enough fuel to go that far. And so the challenge there is, first of all, using them in large enough numbers with sophisticated enough either route planning or coordinated suppression using electronic methods, maybe harm, suppression of Russian air defenses near the front lines to get those drones through the initial kind of belt of defenses. Because once they're inside Russia in depth, even Russia with a lot of GBAD ground-based air defense systems, it can't cover everything. It just doesn't have enough GBAD to cover all the possible routes that you could take for a small UAV, a small, slow, efficient, long-range attack UAV. And so it's a really good method that Ukraine has found to basically conduct harassing attacks, which serve two different functions in the air war. The first function that those harassing attacks with the UAVs serve is straightforward attrition. So where they do manage to actually damage or destroy Russian jets, of course, that's fantastic. That is a permanent loss of a ultimately finite number of assets. That's probably not the biggest impact they have because, unfortunately, Russia does continue to produce, flankers, fullbacks. So most of its modern fighter types at a rate close to, or even in the case of things like the Su-35, exceeding the rate at which they're losing them. And where you destroy aircraft on the ground or damage them beyond economic repair, generally speaking, you're also not killing the crew. And so it's comparatively easy for the Russians to replace those losses over time, but there is an attritional effect that matters in some cases, particularly where you're damaging or destroying strategic bombers, for example, which are much harder for the Russians to replace, and where the fleets are, in many cases, much smaller to begin with. So you're having a greater proportional impact on Russian salvo capacity for cruise missiles and ballistic missiles by targeting those assets. I think perhaps the more important effect for the war as a whole of these long-range drone attacks on Russian air bases is to present Russia with a choice. Either it has to concentrate a disproportionate amount of its ultimately limited ground-based air defense capacity around all the potential air bases that it might be attacked, that it uses for operations against Ukraine. And if it does that, then there are significantly fewer air defenses to deploy along the front lines, which will make Ukraine's ability to use HIMARS, air-delivered munitions from MiG-29, Sukhoi-27, Sukhoi-24, and now F-16. It will make it easier for them to do that. If the Russians don't dedicate significantly increased air defense to defending those airfields in response to the UAV attacks, then they'll essentially have to either accept fairly regular losses, which are probably, even though they can be borne and replaced if it's just occasional, if it becomes a regular thing, they will become unsustainable. So the alternative, which Ukraine is, I suspect, trying to force Russia to do, is if it doesn't pull its air defenses back in significant numbers to defend those air bases, it will have to move its aircraft to conduct the majority of their operations from much further away from Ukraine's borders. And that is probably the best way that Ukraine currently has to reduce the number of glide bombs that are being launched at the front lines. It's not really economically viable to intercept the glide bombs directly. There are just too many of them. You would deplete all your missile interceptors incredibly quickly, even if you were intercepting them successfully. So it's not really viable to do that. And the aircraft launching the glide bombs are doing so from very high altitudes at very high speeds, from tens and tens of kilometers behind the front lines. And so they're a very difficult target for fighters to intercept, even F-16, all of which means that intercepting the Russian glide bomb launching sorties is probably only regularly possible by moving Patriot systems quite close to the front line and attempting edge of the envelope shots, which have been successful on a number of occasions. But it's a huge risk every time you do that the Russians locate and then strike that vital Patriot system that is needed to defend cities, infrastructure, bases. So given all of those difficulties, striking the Russian air bases, even if all it does is force them to move their jets back to flying from air bases further back, that means each glide bomb sortie will take more flight time to get to the front lines and to get back, which means that a given fleet can launch fewer glide bombs. There will be more attrition on the airframes over time. They will burn more hours. They will need more frequent overhauls per glide bomb. The crews will get more tired. So you will again just passively reduce the number of glide bombs that are being launched at the front line. So I think that's probably the main incentive for these long-range attacks on Russian air bases.
But as you explain it does create dilemmas, and it makes me curious about whether this basic new paradigm of being able to overwhelm air bases with cheap drones, does that completely change the equation in air warfare in general about where it's now safe to have to station aircraft? Where can you still have air bases being used? At what range?
So yeah, the Russians have failed to come up with a perfect response. I think the big kind of unanswered part of that question, and probably unanswerable in open source at least, is how many of the drones is Ukraine having to launch in order to get the number that get through, i.e. what is the interception rate? Because that fundamentally dictates what can and can't kind of be done to defend, i.e. how much more is there that the Russians could be doing versus how much are they already doing. And I suspect the number intercepted is fairly high as a proportion of those fired, unless Ukraine, except when Ukraine is able to commit a lot of other enabling capabilities to essentially opening a window for them. So using harm, using electronic warfare, maybe firing HIMARS at targets near the air defenses in those sectors at the same time, so that the air defenses have to choose whether to intercept the HIMARS or the harms, or the UAVs that are passing through at a similar point. But essentially, Russia has a couple of limitations there. Obviously, one of them is the number of air defense systems that Ukraine has managed to destroy over the past 2.5 years. It's not that Ukraine can destroy all the air defenses in a given area. They never managed to do that. But they are inflicting a steady rate of losses over time against particularly Buk, so SA 11, 17, 27 in NATO terms. And we've also seen some successful strikes with a combination of UAVs and ATACMS against S-400 and S-300 sites, particularly in Crimea, in the past 6 months. So there is a material shortage for Russia of ground-based air defenses. So given the range of some of these, relatively slow, but nonetheless relatively large-scale UAV attacks, there is a huge number of potential targets that Russia feels it needs to defend. And of course, we've also seen attacks on a lot of oil and gas infrastructure. We've seen attacks on factories. We've seen attacks even symbolically on Moscow. And so, again, this is just increasing the number of potential targets that Russia feels it has to defend with fundamentally finite ground-based air defense resources that have also seen attrition. In terms of defending against these sort of attacks, for air forces in general going forward, I think what this primarily does is, first of all, mean that having some degree of short-range ground-based air defense at airfields is probably non-negotiable as a requirement for a serious air force now. But primarily, I think, and that will be a combination of soft kill, so to try and disable or degrade navigation to reduce the accuracy of incoming munitions, and also then hard kill to shoot down ones that either still get through or are hardened against that sort of thing, but will therefore be more expensive and in smaller numbers. And the second thing, though, is to really increase the value of Cold War style passive hardening. So there is huge value in hardened aircraft shelters, because while they absolutely can be defeated by ballistic missiles and by cruise missiles, as Russia has done to Ukrainian bases throughout the invasion, the probability of kill of a single cruise missile or ballistic missile against a hardened aircraft shelter is about 0.5 to 0.7, depending on the model of missile. And then it gets a bit lower if you add in some electronic warfare defense for the area. So for a start, you're not getting a 1-to-1 kill ratio, even with those multi-million-dollar missiles. But for UAVs, I mean, no small UAV is getting through a HAZ. A HAZ is metal reinforced concrete. It's not going to be penetrated by a long-range cheap UAV with maybe a few kilos of warhead on it, up to a Shahed, which might have up to 40 kilos of warhead on it. It's not enough to reliably penetrate a HAZ. So those passive defenses, which are relatively cheap compared to active defenses, are potentially a significant asset in defending against UAV-type attacks. The problem for defending Ukrainian air bases at the moment is not so much attacks by Shaheds, it's having something that can sustainably deal with the Orlan, the Zala class medium-altitude reconnaissance UAVs that are then calling in ballistic missile strikes in real time. And it's not that they're difficult to intercept per se, it's that there's a lot of them and they're relatively cheap. And so Ukraine is struggling to intercept them all just because of the drain that it represents on finite missile defense ammunition. Well, UAV missile defenses are probably the most sustainable way of going about this. And Ukraine has a lot of experience of rapidly increasing production of new types of UAVs, so there's probably quite a lot of national capacity there. Ukraine's partners and allies can help to some degree, although not all the Western supplied systems have worked as well. Some have worked well, some have not. And the great thing is that also Ukraine already has a very, very capable acoustic detection, classification, and tracking network across the country that's very difficult to jam or attack, that can help do the detection and tracking piece of that UAV defense puzzle, which for a lot of countries, the detection and tracking is actually the really hard bit, and Ukraine has kind of already got that. So it's a problem that can be solved and must be solved, but it's one that is probably not suitable for being answered by traditional air defense systems.
I think people started to realize this threat of the medium range recon drones, and now it's interesting to see, as you said, those being intercepted by FPVs, but still that's like medium range, that's around up to maybe 100 kilometers. So if we're talking about the long range, if we're talking about the equivalent problem for longer range airfields, well, further back from the front, which is of course more and more important now, especially with F-16s coming in. Do you think on the Ukrainian side, it seems like the odds would be even more against them potentially? Is the answer here just to go underground?
The main threat there is obviously ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as potentially Shaheds. So a lot of Ukrainian airfields are quite large, and moving a relatively small number of aircraft and a relatively small number of maintenance teams with equipment quite regularly, so every few hours, on the airfield, so that they're never just parked in one place for more than a few hours at a time. That will in itself provide a reasonable degree of protection, because actually, even with something large like a ballistic missile, most of an airfield is just grass and concrete. Cluster munition equipped versions of Iskander are the biggest problem because they can cover a fairly wide area. So it doesn't get you out of the problem entirely. And the Russians could always get lucky. But moving on the airbase is a key part of this. And then obviously as often as you can and as much as you can, moving between air bases, so that to stay ahead of that Russian strategic targeting cycle. Because, while you might be able to do some air defense, anything can be saturated. And, Ukraine has a lot of requirements for limited air defense assets and air defense ammunition. One of the constraints for the Ukrainian Air Force is that it's a very large country, and particularly the Soviet-era MiG-29s are very short-ranged, especially when you fly them at low level. So anything that you fly at very low altitude with a jet engine will use a great deal more fuel than if it's flying at high altitude, just because of the way jet engines work and the way drag works. And so when you're in a position where anywhere within at least 150 kilometers of the front lines, you're flying pretty low to stay out of those S-400 missile engagement zones, and S-300, and also to try and make it harder for Russian fighters to detect and reliably track and engage at long ranges. You're using a huge amount of fuel. And so if you're flying from bases far back, Ukraine doesn't have aerial refueling tankers. And in any case, aerial refueling tankers would be pretty vulnerable, again, anywhere near the front lines, because long-range Russian air defenses. So they're generally going to have to land, refuel, and rearm, either on the way in or the way out, or possibly both. And so where you see Ukrainian jets being hit by things like Lancets, it's typically going to be a forward arming and refueling point. And that again comes to that problem of Russian observation UAVs. So you need to have, for the survivability of the Air Force, you have to have a way to sustainably shoot down Orlans, Zalas, foreposts. Because without those assets being able to hover and observe, then Russia can't complete those kill chains generally fast enough to intercept aircraft while they're doing dispersed operations.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. For more expert interviews like this and for comprehensive coverage on developments here in Ukraine, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to support our work, don't forget to go to our website and become a member of the Kyiv Independent.